So after so much optimization sophistication, we will start by a more relaxing sequence where we'll talk about more qualitative things. And then we'll do a bit of theory, in particular about demand curves. So what is demand response? Depending on the authors, you find some subtle differences between demand response and demand side management. Demand side management is often the fact that the electric utility manipulates user appliance. For example, in Switzerland, very often the washing machine is in the basement, and sometimes, it's less frequent now, but sometimes the washing machine is connected to a socket that works only during some periods of the day or of the night. This is, for example, the periods of low tariff. So that's a way to manipulate the demand. Now, if the period is static, well, this is not really not really controlled, but some utilities like Romande Energie and many others have mechanisms to control the time at which to decide exactly when those periods start. So this is called demand-side management. Right? Demand response very often is considered the same, but as a response to price. But not all authors agree. So in this slideshow, I will use demand response and demand-side management as the same, because out of the several hundreds of papers I've listed on demand response, it's not very clear what the difference is. This is, in fact, not very new. It's practically as old as the grids themselves. It was called differently, and people didn't write so many papers as now. But they are called load management. The old systems you find in Switzerland, they use what is called ripple control, where the utility sends a signal, which is in the audible frequency band, that is sent over the electric wires. And then there's a receiver here. When the receiver receives the signal, clack, it switches on or off some of the consumptions, right? And this is very typically done in all countries that have a large nuclear base. Nuclear energy has the property of, what's the main feature of nuclear energy, apart from Fukushima, waste, impossibility to manage the waste, all that stuff. But from a grid viewpoint, what is the main property? It's constant, exactly. So it produces a constant output. Now, some people say they don't. And in Germany, for example, in the past, they used to control the output of nuclear plants, but they were simply dumping. Well, a nuclear plant produces heat, and from heat you produce steam, and the steam engine produces electricity. Now, if you let the steam go in the atmosphere instead of going into the rotors of the generators, you can modulate the power that is produced. But this is cheating. You produce constant power, and then you curtail some of it to produce flexibility. So other countries like France don't do that because they have other ways of controlling it. And one of the ways is, in particular, to adapt the usage to force, for example, all the boilers and a number of appliances to work at night when there is a much less demand. And nuclear plants typically go together with pump hydro, where you pump at night also into some lakes. Here. What could be the possible reasons for doing demand response? The ones you find in the literature. And you should map 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 to A, B, C, D, E. You read papers that say that the goal is to reduce costs, right? And we'll talk about that. In fact, some demand response operators, they claim that they reduce the costs to users. But the true thing is probably number 3. So it's really to optimize the management of the electrical grid. I mentioned nuclear production. That was the motivation for fairly static forms of demand response. Now the motivation today is the volatility of the renewables, the fact that the renewables are much more stochastic than other forms of, not all renewables, but solar and wind are much more stochastic. Hydro is highly, or at least stored hydro is highly predictable and controllable. But because of the larger variability, we want to push some of that variability to the demand side to make the management easier. If we don't do this, what would be the cost? If we live with a grid that has a lot of solar panels, for example, that lose 2/3 of their production when there is a cloud, like for example yesterday, the weather forecast was sunny all day, and then it was cloudy during half of the day, and the clouds came and went. So the production was very variable at time scale of seconds compared to the forecast here. If you don't do demand response to follow that, what will you need to do? Any idea? Any place to start an interesting startup? Or well, if it's not the demand that follows, it has to be generation. So typically what is done today is whenever you do a large solar installation somewhere, you match it with a gas installation that will be able to compensate for the loss of production of the variable solar production, for example. So one solution is to make the compensation on the generation side. But of course, if you can avoid burning gas, that's better. Any idea for another solution? One big solution that we see behind the bicycle shop? Storage, exactly. Batteries. So batteries are an alternative to that, are an alternative to demand response. In fact, demand response is a form of virtual storage, some people consider. Well, I think I overlooked the break. So we stop here and we will resume after the break at 11:15. So we can view demand response as one of the tools that can be used to manage grids, where the main problem of the grid is to balance the energy flows, balance power instantly. As you know, the balance is done by several mechanisms that operate at 3 time scales. In real time, you have what is called frequency response. Then you have secondary reserves that are signals that are sent to generators to adjust their production, increase or reduce their productions. And so it's called secondary response when it's done at the time scale of seconds. And when it's done at larger time scale, it's called tertiary reserve, where it's typically at the time scales of hour. Demand response is one way to provide such reserves, as we will see in a number of examples that are being deployed today. Here is an example from a French system. So that's the typical old-style thing, where in the old style the problem is the night because of nuclear and the peak of the day. Right? So energy consumption is typically peaking in the beginning of in the evening, and if you can find a way to reduce that peak, that is called shaving the peak, then you can, for example, avoid deploying one more nuclear plant. And this is one of the typical uses of demand response that is and was done in the past. What does demand response do? Well, it manipulates the consumption. Of course, not everything can be manipulated. So the light in this room should not be switched off, and this beamer should not be switched off at the time of the lecture. But the heating and the cooling of the system of this room can be manipulated. Now there's no heating, hopefully, because the windows are open. There's a company in Switzerland, there are multiple companies in other countries that manipulate the heating and the cooling. And now in Switzerland, cooling is not really an issue because the hot days are rare events, but in heating is an issue. So those companies, Tico is one of them, they work essentially in the winter. Of course, in the summer, they have nothing to reduce. But things that are very popular in Switzerland are the boilers. So the boilers are typically manipulated by the electricity companies, as are all forms of resistive heating. In fact, one of the energy strategy of Switzerland is to get rid of, that was accepted yesterday, by the way, great news. We should all celebrate in this room. One of the strategies is to get rid of resistive space heating, because, as you know, it's much less efficient than heat pumps. The efficiency is by a factor of 5 to 10. However, they are typically used by electricity company to do demand response. So the electricity company have lost one of the technical means they use to adjust the variability of their production, which today variability is essentially due to forecasting errors. When there is, for example, a huge peak of consumption that was not forecasted, that's very rare, but it can happen. Or when there is a failure somewhere. You lose a generator or you lose a line. If you lose a high voltage line, you may have to reduce the power consumption in one part of the country. And one way to do that is to shut down, for example, all the resistive heating systems. Doing it with heat pumps is a bit more complicated and is done by other companies like Tico. Now the difference is that was done by utilities before, now it's done by a separate company that's called a demand response aggregator. So the market is going away from the utility, which is a challenge to utilities. I'm giving in reference a number of papers that have studied demand response. As I mentioned, there's a huge number of them. And the difficulty is more to find the novelty in a paper than to really understand what they do. So I'll try to cover essentially all that they do. Here is a typical example that comes from Norway, where the tariff is increased at predefined times. So typically there are 2 time slots, 8 to 10 and 5 to 7, which corresponds to the peaks, 2 of the peaks I had in the MPC example below. Now the novelty here is that the price here is variable and is advertised 1 day in advance. But you know in which period of the time there is those high prices. So if you start your washing machine and you have a timer on it, might be a good idea. If you leave in the morning and the dishwasher is started, perhaps it's better to put the timer to start it at 11 o'clock because you might avoid that. And what they show is that in fact this works. So the load is actually in fact influenced largely by this thing. Now the difficulty is of course that the person who pays the bill is not necessarily the person who pushes the button of the appliance. Right? That's one of the, I would say, the tragedies of demand response, is that primitive forms of demand response are assuming consumer engagements, but it's very hard to do consumer engagements. For example, in this room, I mean, do we really care about saving energy? Perhaps some of us do, perhaps in this class you all do, but other groups might not care so much because they're not sensitive to that. So they developed a number of tricks like putting special stickers on all appliances, warning people don't use that appliance at that time of the day. That's the kind of small details you need to worry about. More scientific impacts of this is the impact on prices. So demand in many countries, not in all, I think in Switzerland we're not yet there, but in other countries there is more variable prices of electricity. Some countries have become very aggressive on that. Australia, New Zealand, some parts of the US have very aggressive variable prices of electricity. And the prices of electricity, when they become very variable, they follow the Lagrange multipliers of a DC approximation of the power flows. And we have seen what can happen if you have congestion on a line. All of a sudden, the prices at one place may become very expensive. On the other side, prices might even become negative. That means you are paid to consume. This could happen, for example, when there are highly congested lines and there's overproduction somewhere. If there's overproduction of solar PVs and you lose a high voltage corridor, then what do you do with that? You have to, an intelligent thing would be to curtail the PVs, but if you don't have the means to curtail, you may put the prices negative to force other people who are able to respond to price to absorb that energy. And here, this Norwegian study has shown in Norway, in 2 regions of Norway, the difference in prices at different periods of time. And you see that the prices were here skyrocketing, were multiplied by a factor of 8 during a short period of time in other parts of the country. And this is due to the phenomenon we've seen in the OPF example here. And by having, what they claim is that by using demand response in that area, they could avoid the problem, so that there would be a benefit to users also, that the prices are reduced because you remove the peak demand. This can be modeled by this thing here. So this is showing what is called a supply curve and a demand curve. So we will discuss in a few more minutes, or probably, in a few more minutes, what is a supply, or next week, what is a supply and demand curve. And the economical theory of demand response and of electricity markets in general is that such curves exist and that the market will settle at the intersection between demand and supply. Essentially, the demand curve is the derivative of the value that how much you're willing to pay for a given amount of electricity. And the supply curve is the marginal cost, is the derivative of the cost of producing some amount of electricity collectively for the whole interconnection here. And what we see is that they intersect, for example, here. But if we do demand response, and then we can manipulate the curve, the demand curve, by changing the blue to become red here, by saying if some of the users have what is called a price-dependent bid, that means you agree to consume something if the price is below some level, then that will produce a curve of this shape, as we will discuss in a few more slides. And then if you change the blue to the red, then the intersection moves from here to here, which is in fact a price reduction. That's a very formal way to express simply the fact that if demand decreases, then the price may go down. And as we have seen in the OPF examples, the marginal prices may have huge variability if the transmission network is not transparent, if there are limitations in the transport capability of the transmission network, which is the case in most grids. Then small peaks of demand or impossibility to match the demand locally will force you to increase a generator that is extremely expensive. And instead of using the expensive generator, you can produce negawatts, which means negative watts, by doing demand response here. The example I gave was from Norway. In several places in the USA, they're doing the same here, where in Texas, for example, the problem is not heating, but is cooling. So by doing some demand response events, they're able, for example, to reduce dramatically the power consumption by, in that case, taking direct control of your air conditioner. So if you participate in the program, there's a little box that will be put in your house that controls the air conditioner. And whenever your power company presses the button, your air conditioner is stopped for 1 hour. Now, if your house is hot and humid during that hour, you will suffer. But if you are a bit smart, you will make sure it's cool before. a bit like David Mackay's MPC was trying to heat it before the system. So that's a primitive system where the utility takes control and disconnects. Of course, more modern systems will evolve into sending signals to a home appliance, to a home control system that will do the MPC that we see in David Mackay's house. So if you're looking for a startup to do, then once you master MPCs and all the max transformation, here is one. Here is another example of legacy systems, an old-style system that is done here in our region, Romande Energie. If you own a chalet in the Alps, for example, you might buy cheap electricity by having what is called an interruptible supply. An interruptible supply means, for example, that you can receive supply 8 hours per day. So during only 8 hours, you will be able to pull power from the socket, or 20 hours, depending on the kind of things you want. So 20 out of 24 is typically for heating systems, which means, another way to put it is, you can be interrupted up to 4 hours per period of 24 hours, which can be managed by a different kind of MPC than the one we've seen. Here we're talking of interruptions, not different prices, but you can imagine a controller. So this paper is describing how such a controller would be. Then you can manage your heating even if you're interrupted for 4 hours. Of course, you have to hope that during the interruption, someone will not come and open all the windows and your house will be cold. 8 hours out of 24 is typically for boilers, where you need to, a feature of Swiss houses is that if 4 people take a shower in the morning, a 5th one cannot come because the 8 hours are typically at night. Old styles where those periods were fixed, new styles that it's 8 hours at any time, because now we will follow essentially the PV production to match the needs. Here is another example of a startup company that has emerged a few years ago in France. It's called Voltalis. Voltalis comes to your house and installs a box that they call a Bluepads that receives an interruption signal and that will disconnect your boiler or your heater for, they swear, not more than 60 minutes a day. So it's similar to the interruptible service of Romande Energie, except now it's done by an independent company. How do they live with that? Well, they sell that service to the energy market whenever the intraday market, whenever the French transmission operator puts a bid or puts a call for example, 1 gigawatt of energy, then you can, if you have a nuclear plant or a big gas generator, or if you're owning a park of wind turbines, you can say, I want to sell this energy. Or Voltalis will do it, will say, I can interrupt 1 million boilers, and by doing that, I'm selling you 1 gigawatt. Of course, the boilers have to be on, or the heating has to be on, so it is typically more effective in winter than in summer. Similar schemes exist in the US, in New Zealand, etc., with different names. Now, most of the schemes, at least in Anglo-Saxon countries, come with a monetary reward for the users. If we put that in your house, then you receive a reward. Similar to here it was done by the utility. The utility is giving a monetary reward because the price of electricity is much less for here. You see, it's 14 cents per kilowatt-hour instead of 23 for the non-interruptible service here. So you have a reward on the price by being interrupted. But here Voltalis is a very bold startup. They say, no, we don't pay the user. We just install the thing in your house. You don't get paid for it. We receive money, but you're a good citizen. That's your reward. But they also claim an energy usage reduction. They also claim that you consume less, which is a bit contradictory to what we discussed an hour before the break, where we said the goal of demand response is not to increase energy efficiency, it's just to displace the amount of energy. But they claim they do that. So we'll talk about that and analyze scientifically whether this is true or not and what is behind that. The things we just discussed, like Voltalis, interruptible supply, are acting at periods of 15 minutes to an hour. So they're acting at the time scale of energy. There are other methods that try to act at much faster time scales, at the time scale of primary response. So I just mentioned the three time scale. So this is an illustration that you find on the ENTSO-E documents. That shows what happens. This is an example of a nuclear plant being taken out of service unexpectedly in France. Then at this time, then what happens is the frequency of the continental Europe interconnection, which is shown here. All the systems in all those countries constitute one large synchronous system. The frequency goes down because now there is a power mismatch. The consumption of power is larger than expected, which means that by the frequency going down, all systems in Europe detect this frequency. Now it's a minuscule, it's a few percent of frequency excursions, but it's considered large for an interconnection. So all systems in Europe will compensate by increasing their power by using what is called droop control. All other systems from Spain to Poland will produce more. So they drive faster, if you want, until they re-establish the frequency. But that's the fast response, and that will avoid the collapse. I mean, if you've lost 1 gigawatt here, if you do nothing, the mismatch of gigawatt is not sustainable. The grid will collapse. So we prevent the collapse with primary frequency, and then you need to replace the gigawatt, which is done by secondary frequency controls. That may involve demand response. Voltalis may come here and say, I may provide... no, sorry, Voltalis would not. TICO in Switzerland might come in this time scale and say, now I provide the gigawatt. Now, primary frequency response is universal. The whole interconnection will do it. The other systems are under the responsibility of the area where the thing happens. So if there's a failure in France, it's up to the French transmission area, and France is only one area, to solve the problem, and it will solve it by calling its own reserves. That may involve demand response, and then those reserves, they need to be brought back to their nominal values because another incident might come. So then you start what is called tertiary reserve, which consists in calling other generators, starting, for example, a gas turbine of some kind. And here the gas turbine might be in a foreign country if France is buying energy from a foreign country. This is how grids work today. Now, some people have proposed that the primary frequency response might be provided by appliances, for example, by fridges. Why fridges? Why are they the targets?
They have a higher time constant, like even if it goes off before it gets hot, it stays so hot.
Exactly. So first you can play with them because your fridge is a thermostat-based system. So it's like David's house, that there is a temperature band. It can live, the optimal temperature is 4 degrees, which means you should not increase 4 degrees, but the temperature in the fridge can be anywhere between 2 and 4 degrees. So you can store some cold, although thermodynamically doesn't mean anything, but you can store some cold into your fridge to anticipate a period of higher energy demand, for example. So if your fridge is in the middle, is oscillating between 2 and 4, if there's a demand response event, if you're at 4, you cannot do anything. If you're at 2, you can do something. So if you're controlling a fleet of fridges, and there are many because every house has a fridge, and they work all the time, winter and summer. So a large country has millions of fridges. That's a fleet that you can control. Statistically, out of the million fridges, if you install a demand response system into them, then half of them would be between 2 and 3 degrees, for example, if they are constantly oscillating between 2 and 4, which means that half of them could respond to a demand response event. So that's a proposal that has been done very seriously. In fact, there is on the table a proposal to do it in the UK, to make it mandatory that every fridge sold in the UK would have a controller that responds to frequency. So that if the frequency is below the nominal frequency of the UK, which I believe is 50 Hertz in the UK, and 60 Hertz in the US, and 50 in the UK, I think, yes. And then if the frequency is below, then it would respond with a control law that is given by something like this finite state machine that's given here. Still not implemented. Not everybody agrees in the UK. Why is the problem coming more in the UK than in the rest of the world? This is because the UK is an interconnection of its own. So the Britain, so England, Wales and Scotland, is one synchronous system. Ireland is also another synchronous system. So those are synchronous systems that are much smaller than the rest of Europe, so the needs for regulation are much larger. They pay more for regulation. They are interconnected to the continent, but with DC lines, not with AC lines. So they are not synchronized with the continent. If there is, on the image I gave here, if there is a failure in the UK, Europe doesn't provide primary frequency support. So the cost of frequency support in the UK, and even more so in Ireland, and in small islands that are in the Canaria or Madeira, etc., those islands here that are not connected to the mainland, the cost of reserves is very large. Cost of electricity in general on Ireland is very large because you cannot benefit from the large scale. So one way to solve the problem has been proposed here to make the fridges by playing in the, so here you look at the frequency that the fridges would monitor, and then when the frequency is very large, depending on the temperature and of the fridge, it will or will not delay essentially its action. I will skip that. And the analysis that they've done is the impact of the amount of reserves. And you see, for example, that without demand response, so this is showing in case of a power, so here reserves are considered important not so much because of renewables, but because of power contingency, for the failure of something. Then you see the amount of reserves that you need to follow a change in frequency, and with demand response, without demand response, you see the values here, and with demand response, you find the value there, which means if I look, for example, if there is frequency, if you want to be able to have a frequency, power mismatch of 0.4 per unit, the frequency deviation you will have without demand response will be 0.2, and with demand response will be much less. So there will be much less reserves needed. For the UK, the computation have been done that it can halve the required reserve if all fridges would solve that, right? Similar papers have been done for the US, in particular in Florida, by controlling, surprisingly, the fans. So the US is powered by fans. So the heating, cooling uses fans, and of course the compressor uses a lot of power, but the fans surprisingly also a lot of power. And some papers have evaluated that 70% of the need of the secondary regulation power in the US could be provided by simply controlling the fans alone in all of the US, right? So that's a very, I mean, to give the order of magnitude, I mean, you can have gas power stations that will burn gas to provide a service, which is only regulation, so a zero average service just to match the demand, or you can simply use essentially information technology and control theory to do that on fans, which is not burning any gas, using a bit of energy from running the controllers, but still much less. Another example that is at an even larger time scale is in this paper by people from IBM Zurich, where they've studied for the case of Switzerland the possibility to use the boilers as secondary reserves. Here it's interesting because it's a more original look. They are looking here at what is called the energy curve. So the energy curve is plotting as a function of time the integral of the energy that a certain fleet of boilers is requesting. And this is providing an upper and a lower bound. The upper bound is the energy you would get if you fill the boiler as early as possible. So the greedy approach. Whenever a boiler has a certain amount of water, it's always full in principle, but the temperature of the hot water varies. It can be from 50 to 90 degrees. So the amount of heat that you are in the boiler, you have some flexibility. And if you heat it up as soon as possible, which means before the morning comes, and it's full with maximum energy, then you have this curve. If you do it as late as possible, which is just before the people take a shower, and if you, for example, you feed it at exactly the rate at which the heat is used by consumers, you obtain this lower curve here, right? And then the idea is, if I'm now managing, assume I'm doing a startup demand response company that manages 1 million boilers, then I know this is my consumption. It has to be anywhere here. So if I do a set point of the boilers that is just in the middle, or for example this red curve here, if I'm here on this curve at this point, I can, by stopping a number of boilers, I can start delaying the curve, so I can move closer to this one here, or I can start more boilers to come here. So I have a flexibility to consume more or to consume less. So I have a virtual generator. If I consume less, if I go more to this curve here, I can, if I continue here, I can, if I consume less, it's the equivalent of a generator. If I move very quickly, I can absorb more here. Which is the thing that's expressed here, right? If I'm running on this curve here, if I stop the curve here, that's the equivalent of generating power. And if I resume here, I can I consume power. So this ability to stop here is what they sell on the tertiary reserve market. If there is somewhere an outage in the grid and the grid asks for a few hundreds of megawatts, then if we manage to run the boilers on this middle curve, then I can provide this type of response here. And they called it for, they've sized it to several hundreds of megawatts here. I mentioned islands. The exercise has been done in detail for this island here. I believe it's Bornholm. This is a Danish island, though it's closer to Sweden. And like for many islands, electricity, the cost of electricity is a problem. And because this is in Denmark, they are very serious about green energy. So they have put a number of wind energy on the island. And so you have the numbers here. The peak demand on this island is 55 megawatt. The supply is 30 megawatts of wind turbines. There's a 60 megawatt AC cable. But the problem is that it often gets cut because it's in the sea, but it's very shallow here. Sometimes the boats, they just touch the cable and cut it. So they often, and ideally they would like to get rid of this cable and live based on their own energy. And for that, they have 35 megawatts of combined heat and power plants. So they have potential 65 megawatts for 55 megawatts of demand, so that's doable. However, this is the production of wind here, right? And the production of wind, it looks like something very variable with an average which is perhaps 1/3 or 1/10 of the peak here. So there is huge variability. And also the generation may become large in winter when you need heating. And this thing here, which is using coal for producing heat and power, cannot ramp up very fast. So you have The problem is to follow the variability of this. And what they did is to provide a system for demand response in all houses, which are using essentially resistive heaters, and they show essentially that it works, that they can live with that. So that the island can be truly islanded and disconnected from the mainland by managing the variability with demand response. A problem of the utilities is, utilities have two problems in the short term. One is a good one, one is a bad one. The bad one is that the consumption is reducing because of energy efficiency. So if you're in a business where you sell less, usually it's a problem for your business, right? You have less revenue, that's the bad side, and one thing that utilities have to manage. But the converse side of it is the electric cars, right? The electric cars are using a lot of electricity. Of course, they're much more efficient than fuel-based cars, but they, compared to what you use for in a household that is not using electricity for heating, for example, if you buy an electric car, you probably double your electricity consumption if you charge it at home. Right? So that's good news. It's good news for the planet, and it's good news for the electricity company, because they will sell more electricity. They can be in business again. However, as some of you in the room who work on such projects know well, that's also a stress for the distribution grids. And you see that some of the, here is the anticipated voltage obtained by doing some load flow simulation. You see that the voltage might have problems when you have lots of electric cars, but also the losses. The losses on the grids may become very large. And sometimes also even there might be ampacity problems. So some grids, not all, but in many countries that have tested large penetration of electric cars, come to the conclusion that above 30% of penetration of electric cars, the distribution grids have problems. So you need to do something about it. What can you do about it? Well, one rational thing is to put a battery close to the charging station, so to charge the batteries, like the big battery that is outside here, during the off-peak periods, where there's lots of solar energy and the cars are not at home, and use that local power to feed the cars. There has been other proposals to use the car batteries themselves to store energy. But another thing that has been proposed is to schedule the consumption of the cars. So instead of plugging your car and charge it at peak power, then you can write an optimization problem very much in the sense of all the optimization problems that we've written before, where you can control, for example, here, the DC currents that is used by a given car for charging. And if you control this, of course, you have the unpleasant side on the user side that you will not have peak power, but you will be able to avoid congestion of the grids, for example, here. So I will skip some of the detail. I will skip this and come back perhaps to my conclusion. So there's a very large literature on demand response. And here is in one summary all the expected things that you read in the papers. Demand response can be done in a static way by direct control, by time of use, by control by tariff. Direct control is control by quantity. You interrupt a supply. The mode of communication of doing this demand response event in the old style is using in-band tones. That's the state of the art that's been around for 50 years. More modern ways is to use a standard called OpenADR. OpenADR is a computer-to-computer protocol, application layer protocol, that specifies that exactly how you code messages like, here is now the new tariff, or here is an interruption message here. So we expect in the future to use OpenADR and the smart house controllers, for example, to decide to run the MPC with David's house, for example, if the prices themselves become variable. Now, the interesting thing about demand response is that it plays over a whole set of timescales, from large timescales, as we have seen with the boilers of Sundstrom and others at IBM, to real time with fridges in the UK and other systems. The benefit of demand response is that we're not moving any energy, so the energy cost is practically zero. We'll talk about it in the theory part. Is it really zero? But there's a drawback. What are the potential drawbacks? I haven't listed here because I want to be positive, but what are the potential drawbacks of demand response? Compared to a diesel generator. Well, it's the limited availability of energy. Like demand response is more comparable to a battery. You can do a demand response event. You can stop all the boilers in France for 1 hour, but not for 48 hours. So you can do for some time, but if you've stopped them for 1 hour, the next hour you can't use them anymore. So it's like having a battery that you can use for until it's empty. When it's empty, you can't use it. So those are equivalent to energy storage, but small energy storage. Comparable, in fact, to the usage of batteries, which are also today for intraday or up to a few days, but not more in terms of battery here. There are other drawbacks. It's also less controllable. A battery is perfectly controllable, except if it's flooded with salt water or things like this, but as long as it works perfectly controllable. Now, of course, demand response works if, for example, you can stop your heaters if you're heating. If nobody's heating because it's the summer, it doesn't work. So you still have a delicate point where you need to monitor what is happening and try to forecast in advance whether people will be using things so that you can stop them. So it has some of those drawbacks here. Voltalis claims that customers benefit by seeing a reduced energy bill. Do you believe in that? I close the poll. So we have a tie on yes and no. So the majority says, if I add 2 and 3, the majority say they are lying, right? Which would be weird, right? Even in France, you cannot lie too long. So if users don't see a reduction, probably there would be a problem, right? So why would there be a reduction? 44% of you said yes. Why would there be? Why, by putting a demand response event, why would we reduce the total consumption?
Maybe due to the losses, like when you have all the loops at a time, you have higher.
Because of the losses.
Yeah.
That is certainly true, but that will not be visible to the users. I mean, the losses in the grid are not charged to the users, at least not directly. They are charged through the access rate to the grid, but they are not charged directly. I mean, the power you pay on your meter is the power you've consumed. the losses in the grid. It's true, by doing demand response, we streamline the grid, so we expect to reduce the losses with a benefit. But that would not be the reason for users to see a difference. Yes?
Maybe, but it's not on the consumed energy, it's on the price. Like the time when you don't get to use your boiler is the time when there is the most price of energy, so it's also the most expensive, so you're actually not using it in the highest price per kilowatt.
That could be, but there's no variable price in France in this setting. So that could be a very good reason. But many of you said, some of you said total energy consumed is increased. Well, why could that be? Well, that's a question that I will leave open for next week. So we'll see the answers to the solutions to that for next week. But the question is valid. I mean, is it by shifting the loads, am I just displacing the load consumption, or am I increasing, or am I reducing? I mean, if you have a job to do now, and you say, no, I will not do it now, I will do it tomorrow. Sometimes it will cost you more to do it tomorrow. Sometimes it will cost you less. So we will discuss that next week.